Hey there. Tonight we're exploring the bizarre evolution of the American soda fountain. From pharmacy fizz and patent syrups to Prohibition's marble-topped dry saloons. Not the malt shop montage, you know. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now find your comfort zone. Perhaps turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's venture into tonight's story together. It begins with a drug, not the illegal kind, the pharmacy kind. Bitter powders and mysterious tinctures, all in the name of health. Then a hiss of gas cuts the silence. Bubbles explode across a glass. And suddenly, medicine tastes like a party. That's the American soda fountain. Born out of chemistry labs and apothecary counters, built into marble temples during the Temperance Crusade, crowned by ice cream during Prohibition, and later turned into one of the most photogenic battlegrounds of the civil rights era. It's the strange, fizzy love child of science. Moral panic, clever marketing, and dessert. The fact that it starts in a lab is almost too neat. In 1767, Joseph Priestley, a curious English clergyman with a thing for gases, figured out how to infuse water with what he called fixed air, carbon dioxide over a beer vat in Leeds. He wasn't trying to invent a treat. He was trying to reproduce the mineral springs people swore cured everything from melancholy to migraines. Then, in 1783, Johann Jacob Schwepp took that concept and built an actual business for it in Geneva, moving later to London. Europe's fancy spas had an indoor cousin, bottled seltzer. The United States watched, learned, and by the early 1800s, pharmacists were tinkering with homemade rigs that made clean, controlled bubbles in the back of the shop. A few names anchor the American origin story. New York's John Matthews, a British-born dentist turned inventor, began building soda apparatus in 1832. His device used acid on marble chips, literal marble, the same stone used in fancy monuments, to release carbon dioxide on demand. The chemistry was simple and elegant. Calcium carbonate meets acid, out comes CO2. Matthews scaled an industry with it, his name etched into trade catalogues by the 1840s. In Philadelphia, a French perfumer named Eugene Roussel got bored making people smell good, and in 1838 started flavoring his carbonated water with syrups. Vanilla, lemon, raspberry. Imagine the moment a dreary glass of medicinal fizz turned into something a person actually wanted to drink. That pivot from remedy to flavor is the crack of thunder that changes the landscape. The early customers were, ironically, patients. Soda water rode into American life on the back of health crazes. Everyone had dyspepsia in the 19th century, the one-size-fits-all diagnosis for indigestion, anxiety, and general misery. Carbonated water got marketed as digestive salvation. Pharmacies were the logical home. They already sold effervescent powders, like the Seidlitz, tiny chemical kits that foamed in the glass. Adding flavored syrups was the gateway move. By the 1840s and 1850s, the pharmacy counter with a shiny gooseneck tap, a stack of glass tumblers, and towering jars of vividly colored syrups felt as common as a cough drop display. Infrastructure quietly made it possible. Ice, for one thing. The country owes cold drinks to a Boston merchant named Frederick Tudor, the ice king who began shipping New England pond ice to southern cities and the Caribbean in the 1810s. By mid-century, American cities had ice houses, and pharmacies could promise something thrilling, a drink colder than the weather. Meanwhile, urban gas works and improved pumps made pressurized carbonation practical. People didn't need to be at a spa to get spa bubbles. Then the temperance movement slams into the narrative like a well-meaning freight train. By the 1870s, reformers were hammering on alcohol as the source of every social evil, and soda fountains offered a sparkling moral alternative. No taverns, no barflies, just a bright counter, well-scrubbed surfaces, and a drink that wouldn't put anyone under the table. Smart entrepreneurs leaned into this clean vibe. A Boston silverware dealer named James W. Tufts started making elegant soda apparatus in the 1860s. His Arctic soda equipment and turned them into full counters. Profits were good enough that he later bought 6,000 acres of North Carolina sandhills and built the resort town of Pinehurst in 1895. That is not a joke. Soda money built golf courses. By the 1880s and 1890s, American cities sprouted what trade magazines called soda temples. Interiors overflowed with carved onyx, beveled mirrors, and lamps that made the place glow like a stage set. The American Soda Fountain Company, created in 1891 from a merger of manufacturers, sold entire counters so ornate they looked like altars. The marble wasn't just aesthetic, it was practical. Easy to clean, didn't absorb syrups, chilled nicely, but the spectacle mattered. People came to be dazzled as much as served. Old photos in the Library of Congress show counters long enough to land a small plane and rows of gleaming taps that look like brass serpents. Staff weren't just clerks, they were performers. The person behind the counter literally jerked a handle to draw soda, and the name stuck. The Soda Jerk. He wore a white jacket and a little cap, and deployed a theatrical toolkit. Long-handled mixing spoons, soda spoons with twisted shafts, fruit knives, shining scoops, etched glasses. A jerk who could stack 3 scoops in one move got respect. In 1915, trade press was already immortalizing their cadence. Jerk the tap, swirl the syrup, snap the straw into the glass with a flourish. It was informal food science, and it required skill. Wages hovered in the low teens per week in the 1910s, rising to around $12, $18 for full-time jerk work in the 1930s, often plus tips. The job attracted young men who liked being at the center of everything and could memorize dozens of house drinks. A big star enters the cast in 1874. Philadelphia's Robert McKay Green gets credit for the ice cream soda during the Franklin Institute's semi-centennial celebration. The story he told later goes like this. His soda fountain ran out of sweet cream, so he used vanilla ice cream instead. And boom, civilization advanced. Other claimants exist, because glory has enemies. But Green's 1874 date carries weight in trade sources and city histories. The ice cream soda became the soda fountain's hamburger, the anchor that draws crowds. From there, the fountain goes dessert forward. Charles Hayes rolls out root beer to a national audience at the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia, selling it first as a dry extract, to be mixed with water. It started as root tea, a medley of sassafras, sarsaparilla, wintergreen, and roots familiar to American herbal tradition. Marketing nudged it into a manlier beer, minus the fermentation. In 1893, Frank J. Wisner in Cripple Creek, Colorado, drops a scoop of vanilla ice cream into his root beer and calls it the Black Cow. Around the same time, or slightly earlier, the sundae emerges as a legal workaround in towns that frowned on fizzy drinks on the Sabbath. It's photogenic myth territory. Two Rivers, Wisconsin, claims an 1881 origin via druggist Edward Berners. Ithaca, New York, counters with documented ads for a cherry sundae in 1892 or 1894 from Chester Platt's shop. Both cities have plaques. Food historian Ann Cooper Funderburg, in Sunday Best, lays out the evidence and concludes the story is messy. Sunday laws existed in plenty of towns. Soda water made noise and sometimes attracted rowdier crowds, and some municipalities banned it on Sundays. Whether a Sundayless Sunday was the precise trigger everywhere remains unprovable. But the timing matches. Ice cream plus syrup in a glass dish absolutely worked, with or without a sermon. Not everything was dessert. Early fountains also dispensed phosphates, the 19th century energy drink. Eben Norton Horsford, a Harvard chemist, patented acid phosphate in the 1860s. Mixing it with soda water and fruit syrup created a bright, tart drink with genuine brio. The lime phosphate became a countrywide staple. Bar guides and fountain manuals from the 1890s and early 1900s list phosphates as core recipes. Even now, bartenders rediscovering vintage techniques called Darcy O'Neill's 2010 book Fix the Pumps their roadmap for resurrecting phosphates and forgotten syrups. This is where the cure-alls crash into caffeine and coca. The 1880s are a boiling pot of stimulants. In France, Angelo Mariani markets his coca wine, Vin Mariani, starting in 1863. Doctors recommend it. Pope Leo I reportedly carried a bottle. American pharmacists take notes. In Atlanta, a wounded Confederate veteran turned pharmacist, John S. Pemberton, sells his own French wine coca in 1885. Local prohibition votes force Atlanta dry in 1886. He reformulates without alcohol, adds cola nut caffeine, drops the wine, and ships a syrup to Jacob's Pharmacy to be mixed with soda water. Coca-Cola is born as a fountain drink that year, sold for 5 cents a glass. Company law says sales averaged 9 glasses per day that first year. Asa Candler buys full control by the early 1890s and turns the syrup into an advertising juggernaut. Dr. Pepper appears slightly earlier in Waco, Texas, in 1885, credited to pharmacist Charles Alderton at Wade Morrison's old corner drugstore. The name's origin remains contested. There's no verified Dr. Pepper. The person and the company leans into the mystery and 23 flavors aura. Pepsi shows up in New Bern, North Carolina. In 1893 is Brad's drink, made by Caleb Bradham, and takes the Pepsi-Cola name in 1898. Its brand suggests digestion, but despite rumors, pepsin probably wasn't an ingredient. A pharmacist knew better than to promise a digestive enzyme in a fountain syrup. Even before federal law cracked down, the chemistry of the glass evolved. Early Coca-Cola contained coca leaf extract, which originally would have included trace amounts of cocaine. Estimates vary, and the company switched to spent, decocainized leaves by 1904. The passage of the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act shoved the entire industry into a new reality. Labels had to stop making extravagant health claims, and drug content faced scrutiny. In 1909, federal agents seized barrels of Coca-Cola, claiming the caffeine content was harmful and the name misleading. The Supreme Court's 1911 decision in United States v. 40 barrels and 20 kegs of Coca-Cola didn't end the case on the spot. It reversed a lower court and allowed seizure, which pushed negotiations. The company reduced caffeine, adjusted claims, and carried on. Fountain culture survived with a little less swagger in the prescription department. Meanwhile, the equipment got better, flashier, and more consistent. Jacob Bauer's Liquid Carbonic Company in Chicago, founded in 1888, perfected compressed CO2 cylinders and reliable carbonators. Suddenly, any pharmacy could keep a stable fizz going without relying on cracked marble grit and acid fumes out back. That meant less drama behind the counter and more reliable drinks in front of it. Trade journals like the Soda Fountain, an American druggist, exploded with ads for taps, marble slabs, syrup pumps, glassware, and the newest fountain fronts. Some counters stretched 40 feet. Others anchored entire lunchrooms with booths and mirrored back bars. The paradox was delicious. A place simultaneously selling morphine by prescription and strawberry sodas for the kids. The cultural positioning sharpened and sweetened. A fountain was respectable for women to visit alone, in a way saloons were not. Ladies' counters were a selling point. It was also a teen space, and by the 1910s moralists noticed. The drink wasn't the real worry. The mingling was. If anything, fears focused on stimulation, sugar plus caffeine, and the proximity of youthful elbows. Newspaper editorials tut-tutted about long hours spent at the counter. The free refills at some spots. Yes, that happened in competitive downtowns. Stretched dates across entire afternoons. Fountains leaned into the harmless fun of it all. House specialty Sundays sprouted whimsical names. A banana split could arrive like a centerpiece. 3 scoops, chocolate and strawberry syrups, nuts and whipped cream. All for 10 or 15 cents before World War I in plenty of towns. Prohibition in 1920 didn't invent the soda fountain, but it made the fountain the most legal fun in the neighborhood. Bars went dark. Soda counters stayed lit. Breweries pivoted. Schoenhofen Edelweiss Brewing Company in Chicago rolled out Green River, a neon lime soda, in 1919 to provide something for people to drink when beer taps ran dry. It became a Midwestern favorite at fountains. The Walgreens chain shows what steady demand looked like on a spreadsheet. Charles R. Walgreen grew the company from 20 stores in 1919 to 525 by 1929, with fountains front and center. In 1922, a Walgreens employee named Ivar Pop Colson started adding 2 scoops of ice cream to the malted milk formula and created the modern malted milkshake, the kind thick enough to levitate a straw. William Horlick had patented malted milk back in 1887 as a food drink for infants and invalids. America tasted it and decided it was for teenagers and everyone else too. Every piece of the room had a sensorial logic. Fans moved air down the counter to keep the ice from sweating too fast. Etched glasses weren't just decorative. Initials and logos helped bartenders identify houseware. Straws made from waxed paper. Thank DC inventor Marvin C. Stone's 1888 patent kept the era's spectacular mustaches free of foam, and mustache cups did the rest. Mirrors multiplied space and made towering sundaes look like sundaes had siblings. The word hygienic appeared in ads as forcefully as delicious. This mattered. Cities battled typhoid and cholera in the late 19th century. A clean counter wasn't just a vibe. It was a promise. There is an inconvenient truth in all the sparkle. Many fountains drew color lines because the country did. Whites only. Signs hung above soda counters in the South, and unwritten rules governed who got served where elsewhere. When black college students sat down at the Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, on February 1st, 1960, they were sitting at a style of counter that had grown up with the soda fountain, a combined lunch and soda bar where coffee, sandwiches, milkshakes, and sodas flowed under the same mirror. That sit-in sparked a movement that spread across lunch counters throughout the South, including places famous for their sundaes and sodas. The photographs of those counters, glossy, clean, with rows of stools, became emblems of polite rebellion. The fountain aesthetic meant to telegraph calm legitimacy. reflected back the everyday violence of exclusion. When the Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination in public accommodations, that marble counter was part of what the law covered. The fountain's dialect shaped how Americans talk. The beverage became a linguistic boundary marker. Soda clustered in the northeast and west coast. Pop dominated the Midwest. Coke became a generic term in many parts of the South, often meaning any cola or soft drink. Brand loyalty aside, linguists mapped it decades later in surveys. But the roots were there in the fountain era, when the operator asked for orders and wrote shorthand. Brand names, house names, and generic terms collided as easily as soda over crushed ice. Myth-busting keeps the story honest. The classic one Coca-Cola invented Santa Claus. The reality, Haddon Sundblom's Coca-Cola ads beginning in 1931 popularized the jolly red-suited Santa in modern American advertising. But he didn't spring from a syrup bottle. Political cartoonist Thomas Nast had already drawn a rotund, bearded Santa in the 1860s for Harper's Weekly, and red and white were not a Coke conspiracy, just the era's favorite palette for a cozy North Pole. Another myth. Dr. Pepper's 23 flavors, unknown, or it contained prune juice. The company has long denied the prune claim, and the specific 23 inches remains a marketing conceit rather than a published ingredient list. The 1024 clock logo was real, though the company's 1934 campaign urging a pick-me-up at 10, 2 and 4 based on research about daily energy slumps. Pepsi claiming Pepsin sat in the bottle. That's a legend too persistent to ignore. No hard evidence puts Pepsin in the formula, and the company's records and historians reject it. One more. Soda jerk created the insult jerk. The timing lines up suspiciously well. Soda jerk is in print by the 1910s, and jerk as a contemptible person appears in the 1930s. But etymologists flag uncertainty. It might be connected, or it might be a parallel slang evolution. Language rarely leaves clean fingerprints. Numbers help frame the scale. A 1904 industry tally counted tens of thousands of fountains operating nationwide, and by the 1910s trade journals praised their army of soda dispensers raising standards. Coca-Cola leaned on fountains hard. Before bottling exploded, most Coke was a fountain drink. Bottling franchise rights were sold off in 1890 to Chattanooga lawyers, Benjamin Thomas and Joseph Whitehead, who built a bottling empire. Still, for decades, fountain sales defined company revenue. That 5-cent glass price stuck like gum under the counter. It became a badge of brand integrity and a marketing prison. The famous nickel Coke lasted from 1886 to 1959, long after inflation begged it to move, because the price was printed all over signs and the vending machines were built for nickels. Negotiations with shop owners got weird. Librarians could probably build a separate exhibit for these price wars alone. Wars rattled the fountain world. World War I brought sugar shortages and price spikes in 1917-1918. The US Food Administration pushed conservation. Non-sugar sweeteners slipped into some formulas. The effect felt temporary. World War II's sugar rationing, starting in May 1942, hit harder. Soda fountains cut portions, reworked recipes, or simply ran out between deliveries. Then something profoundly American happened. The Coca-Cola Company made a pitch to the War Department to get Coke to the troops at 5 cents. The Army welcomed morale boosters. The company built 64 bottling plants near fronts from North Africa to the Pacific, producing millions of bottles for soldiers. That seeded global Coke fandom. Back home, ghee, demand, and rationing meant the fountain line remained long, but sometimes spare. Ice cream shortages turned Sundays into rare treats. Kids who grew up during the war remember no second scoop. Signs like they remember war posters. The 1950s broke the counter. Suburbs sprawled. The family car ruled weekends. Drive-ins and diners multiplied. Fast food chains realized they could profitably move beverages in paper cups with syrup dispensers behind backlines, not ritualized counters. Supermarkets stacked 6-packs of bottled soda by the door. Vending machines climbed every factory hallway and bus station. There were still neon-lit drugstore fountains, slinging malts and patty melts. They just weren't the only show in town. By the late 1950s and 1960s, many pharmacies ripped out their elaborate fountains to use the space for packaged goods. In a cruel twist, the same chains that had grown with the fountain rose by shrinking it. A few old-school counters survived as local legacies, especially in small towns in the South and Midwest. But the mass culture moment was over. The ghosts linger in everyday drinks. The New York Egg Cream, a classic chocolate seltzer in milk cousin, survived into the late 20th century behind neighborhood counters, despite containing neither egg nor cream. Origins sit in the fog between Louis Ulster, a legendary Lower East Side candy shop owner who sold thousands a day in the early 19s, and various storylines pinned to Yiddish theater performers. The most plausible thread positions it as a Jewish-American soda fountain masterpiece. The Boston Cooler, which confuses tourists by being a Detroit thing. Blended Vernor's ginger ale, James Vernor's aged in barrels ginger soda, created in the 1860s, with vanilla ice cream. The name likely came from Detroit's Boston Boulevard, not Massachusetts. Regional drinks anchored identity in a pre-franchise world, and many were born at a fountain, not a factory. Beyond the nostalgia, the soda fountain forged American technique. Jiggers, the measuring tools, mattered. Cleanliness standards rehearsed behind the counter informed later food service norms. Fountain manuals drilled precision. 1 ounce of syrup, 8 ounces of carbonated water for a standard. Top with shaved ice. Stir with a long spoon, present with straw. That is a language modern bars still speak. Acid phosphate measured in drams went into orange phosphates with the specificity of a lab notebook. The photography of the era makes everything look saccharine, but the work resembled mise en place at a cocktail bar. Anne Funderburg's historical overview and Darcy O'Neill's chemistry forward manual both underline how far removed the best fountains were from slapdash soda slop. Something else quietly powered it all. Branding. Etched Coke logos on glasses advertised with every sip. Dr. Pepper's 1024 clock turned into clock faces on the wall. Hires packaged root beer home kits so fathers could play pharmacist in the kitchen. Ads in the soda fountain magazine coached proprietors on lighting, signage, and how to angle mirrors to make spaces look bigger. Consistency trained palates. Phosphates tasted slightly tart with a mineral finish. Colas tasted like caramel, vanilla, spices. Caffeine, sarsaparillas, tasted herbal and vaguely medicinal. Fountain owners built menus around these categories, and customers built bristling opinions accordingly. Not all of it aged gracefully. Sassafras was later recognized to contain safrole, a carcinogen, prompting formulas to switch to artificial flavoring or different botanical blends. Straws, once eco-friendly paper, turned into plastic and then into an ecological headache, and are now migrating back to paper and metal. Caffeine and sugar consumption became public health debates instead of just a jolt and a treat. The fountain's early claims that a phosphate could cure fatigue would read like satire now. If a drugstore soda fountain ran modern health claims from the 1890s, nourishing tonic, it would get a letter from the FDA and probably a few eye rolls on social media. The civil rights chapter never left. Those photos from Greensboro, David Richmond, Franklin McCain, Ezell Blair Jr., and Joseph McNeil, sitting at that Woolworth's counter, gave the fountain a different kind of cultural capital. The sit-ins hammered at the notion that a clean, respectable space could behave like a private club because of race. Thousands of arrests later, desegregation inched forward. When the Civil Rights Act passed in July 1964, the ink applied just as indelibly to counters with soda taps as to dining rooms with white tablecloths. A thing built to symbolize health and public well-being had doubled as an instrument of humiliation. That tension is part of the artifact's power today. The American language picked up additional slang and habits from this world. Sunday, losing the "y" from Sunday, fits the era's delicate piety. Malt as shorthand for milkshake, with malted milk is a fountain nuance, not a brewery term. The jerk station in modern bars borrows its name from that soda handle, and the performance arcs of today's baristas, the ritual, the froth, wall, the froth, the bennies of being seen, at the center of a tightly choreographed space, feel eerily familiar. Replace the mirror with a Lamajoko, and it's just a different set of beans. Hard numbers keep the mind from drifting entirely into sepia. Walgreens growth, 20 stores in 1919, 525 stores in 1929, shows how a big fountain business looked on a ledger line. Haddon Sundblom began painting for Coca-Cola in 1931. Dr. Pepper's 10, 2, 4 started in 1934. Sugar rationing for civilians began in May 1942. Coca-Cola committed to war zone bottling, eventually running 64 overseas plants. The 5-cent price on a glass of Coke held from 1886 to 1959, a 73-year pricing miracle, solved only when pricing, packaging, and vending caught up with reality. The American Soda Fountain Company formed in 1891 and blanketed the country in marble fantasy. Liquid Carbonic, founded 1888, helped standardize carbonation so reliable that, over a century later, people forget there was a time fizz was inconsistent. The 21st century decided to surprise everyone by staging a comeback. Spots like Brooklyn Pharmacy and Soda Fountain opened in 2010 in a restored 1920s apothecary in Carroll Gardens, and similar revivals in cities from Nashville to Los Angeles started doing old drinks with modern ingredients. Real egg creams, orange phosphates made with acid phosphate, resurrected from old patents, house syrups with vanilla beans you can smell, bar programs borrowed into the non-alcoholic side, and the best of them acknowledged their sources. Funderburg's history, O'Neill's recipes, old manuals from American druggist archived in the Smithsonian. This wasn't kitsch, it was serious fun with a bibliography. There's an even bigger twist. The most successful bubbly trend of the 2010 was alcoholic seltzer. Spiked Seltzer launched in 2013, later rebranded as Bon and Viv, and then White Claw blew the roof off in 2016, selling hundreds of millions of cases by the end of the decade. The gentle irony is almost too perfect. The American soda fountain, born as the dry antidote to taverns, shares its carbonation DNA with the canned party that took over beaches and tailgates. The wheel turns. The reward for knowing the past is laughing at the cycles without falling out of the chair. Real people shaped micro-scenes inside the broad narrative. James W. Tufts parlayed polished counters into a resort. Louis Auster supposedly sold so many egg creams in early 1900s, New York, that his milk bill could scare a dairy. Jacob Bauer turned gas into an essential ingredient. Charles Hayes took a folk beverage and trademarked the taste of an American season. Pharmacists, like Charles Alderton, mixed aromatic oils behind the counter with the same concentration a bartender brings to a Manhattan. Robert M. Greene's 1874 ice cream soda hovered at the hinge point between tonic and treat. Caleb Bradham became a fable about entrepreneurial rise and fall. Pepsi prospered, then collapsed during sugar price volatility in World War I, then re-emerged later after bankruptcy with invigorated leadership. The soda fountain made heroes and ghosts. One underappreciated subplot involves design and materials. Onyx fronts weren't just onyx. Manufacturers loved using trade-named glass, like vitrolite, in the 1920s and 1930s. Colored opaque glass used for sleek, sanitary, modern interiors. Fountains transitioned from Victorian excess to Art Deco lines. The hardware tightened up too. Spring-loaded taps gave consistent flow. Invisible carbonators under the counter delivered a particular bubble size, not the brash, prickly fizz of poorly mixed seltzer, but a softer effervescence that held syrups better. People learned what to expect in each city. A Chicago cherry phosphate hit, different than a Boston one. The type of acid phosphate mattered. The ratio mattered. The politics of sweetness made headlines long before nutrition labels. Around 1912, state chemists tested syrups for adulteration, and paperwork flew. The Bureau of Chemistry, the ancestor of the FDA, published bulletins naming brands that cut corners. Pure was a sales magnet. Parlor menus printed, made with pure cane sugar, like a shield. Branding became a moral stance. Anecdotes about minor accessories turn into cultural history if the lens is sharp. The bendy straw, invented by Joseph B. Friedman in 1937, after watching his daughter struggle with a straight straw at a soda fountain, turned into an accessibility tool as much as a convenience. He patented it in 1937 and founded the Flex Straw Company. The little paper hats worn by soda jerks reinforced a sanitary image at a time when hairnets were still a punchline. Even the tool-footed glass for a sundae, the tulip glass, performed nostalgia in real time, shaping how dessert should look, gifting everyone the mental image now printed on diner menus across the country. A more obscure, but very fountain core trend was the spritzer's cousin, the egg drink. Raw eggs appeared in a number of fountain recipes as protein boosters, egg phosphates, egg lemonades, even egg sherry flips, when local laws and attitudes permitted. Eggs were considered nourishing energy food, the way protein powder might be now. Modern sensibilities flinch. Historical menus read it and shrug. Food histories knit these drinks to larger Victorian protein obsessions, and to the idea that a counter could serve both sick people and hungry teenagers without changing outfits. Regional brands that now feel niche had national aspirations. Moxie, created in 1876 by Augustine Thompson, in Massachusetts, pitched itself as nerve food and grew into one of the earliest widely bottled soft drinks. Its gentian bitterness once made Coca-Cola look sweet. In the early 20th century, Moxie even briefly outranked Coke in New England sales, deploying weird marketing, like a car topped with a life-size horse, the Moxie Horsemobile, to drive attention. The word Moxie entered American slang, meaning gumption, by the 1930s. Cheerwine, invented in Salisbury, North Carolina, in 1917, brought wild cherry sweetness to soda fountains and remains a southern touchstone. The palette of drinks at a fountain wasn't as narrow as a modern soda fountain behind a fast food counter. It was closer to a menu at a cocktail bar, just without any aber. Binding it together, there's an epilogue that squares the circle. Carbonated water started life as medicine. The fountain turned it into a social ritual, wrapped in marble. Carla stormed in as tonics and left as brands. Phosphates bridged chemistry and taste. Sundays made moral loopholes delicious. Prohibition gave the counter the spotlight. World War II globalized American bubbles. Civil rights made the counter a line in the sand. Suburbs and bottling made the line shorter. Then revivalists polished the brass again, because humans like ceremony with their sugar, and those long-handled spoons are infinitely Instagrammable. Accuracy has a backbone here, fed by archives and people who did the homework. Ann Cooper Funderburg's Sunday Best lines up the dates and demystifies the myths. Darcy O'Neill's Fix the Pumps reverse engineers the recipes. Dried like time capsules, listing price points, glassware suppliers, and house recipes for Bronx egg creams. The Coca-Cola Company's own timeline asserts that 1886 delivered the first glass at Jacob's Pharmacy and 9 servings per day in that first year. The Dr. Pepper Museum in Waco maintains that the Dr. Pepper name origin is unknown, and that prune juice never belonged in the formula. The Supreme Court's 1911 decision in the Coca-Cola caffeine case lives in U.S. reports. Photographers in the Library of Congress show onyx counters gleaming under electric light. And Howard University's archives house grey-scaled faces at sit-ins that will outlast every brand slogan. The part that seals the soda fountain as an American story is its comfort with contradiction. The counter sold both cough syrup and chocolate sundaes. It promised health while measuring sugar by the barrel. It offered a safe space for women while denying seats to black customers. It encouraged teenage loitering and then tutted about it in editorials. It invented the treat as a public ritual and then watched its ritual outsourced to cardboard cups and drive-through windows. Somehow through all that, a phosphate still tastes like plausible energy, and a chocolate malt still tastes like high school. There's a bonus detail for anyone who loves the systems behind things. Carbonation has texture. Fountain soda's bubbles are less aggressive than many bottled versions. That's not nostalgia, it's physics. Carbonation level, temperature, syrup viscosity, and the shape of the glass change bubble formation and head retention. Traditional fountains carbonated water separately, then pulled soda and syrup together in the glass, giving the drink a gentler, more integrated fizz and a foam cap that carried aromatics to the nose. Modern premix dispensers simplify the dance. They work. They just feel different. Enthusiasts can read long forum threads about bubble size because the ritual coded itself into the palate. Soda fountains changed eating too. The lunch counter menu: club sandwiches, tuna melts, chicken salad, on toast, patty melts, pie a la mode, crossed into diners and chain restaurants. That narrow stainless space behind the counter taught line cooks to move along rails, turning out consistent, quick food. If the soda fountain had only left that behind, it would still loom large. The fact that it also left behind entire city blocks of American memory, first dates, after-school games of flirting and fries, grandparents pointing at stools and telling stories about nickels and wartime ration cards, makes the marble more than decoration. It makes it an archive. Even the decline wrote itself into pop culture. The Rolling Stones' Brown Sugar came long after the fountain era, but the word sugar has always been shorthand for unearned pleasure. That's where the half-smirk around soda fountains comes from. They were supposed to be the clean alternative to the saloon. They turned out to be artfully addictive in their own way. In the 1890s, Critics fretted about soft drink fiends lurking at counters. In the 1950s, parents looked at teenagers and wondered whether a second malt would blow the grocery budget. In 2023, whole health debates orbit around ultra-processed foods. The fountain just sits there in vintage sepia, smiling like a cat that knows it will be irresistible. Again, as soon as someone invents a reason to queue for fizz, the reason keeps arriving. Modern non-alcoholic cocktail menus read like fountain specials. Shrubs, vinegar and fruit syrups, resurrected from 19th century farm kitchens. Gum syrup for texture, lacto-fermented sodas with controlled tartness, clarified juices for clarity and sparkle. Chefs build desserts in tall glasses because gravity makes sauce cascade in a photogenic way. Coffee bars shake espresso with ice because they understand theatre. None of that would surprise a soda jerk from 1915. If anything, it would make him feel like the world finally caught up. That's the arc. From Priestley's gas experiments in 1767 to Schwecker's business in 1783. From John Matthews's marble apparatus in 1830 to Eugene Roussel's flavoured drinks in 1838. From James Tufts's Arctic apparatus in the 1860s to the American Soda Fountain Company's 1891 marble masterpieces. From Robert McKay Green's 1874 ice cream soda to the Sunday wars of the 1890s. From Charles Heyer's 1876 root beer to Frank Wisner's 1893 float. From Dr. Pepper in 1885 to Coca-Cola in 1886 to Pepsi in 1898. From the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act to the 1911 Supreme Court tussle over caffeine. From Walgreens 20 stores in 1919 to 525 in 1929. Ivar Coulson's 1922 malted shake Apex. From the tin-stamped 10, 2, 4 Dr. Pepper campaign in 1930, 4 to Sunday on a Night stagecraft. From World War II sugar rationing in 1942 and 64 Coke plants overseas to the 5-cent Coke era closing in 1959. From Greensboro stools in 1960 to the Civil Rights Act in 1964. From closures in the 1960s and 1970s to revivals in 2010. From straight seltzer to hard seltzer. All fizz, no fiction. The American soda fountain started out to fix stomachs and wound up fixing moods. It marched through Victorian science, temperance piety, progressive era morality, prohibition cunning, wartime shortages, post-war convenience, and modern nostalgia without losing the core trick. No matter the decade, a cold, bubbly drink in a pretty glass hits like the sound of a favorite song. The science is easy. The spell is harder to explain. Consider it solved every time a syrup stream meets a carbonated pour, foam blooms, and a counterpast or present becomes a tiny stage for ritual and delight. And now, let's continue with our next story. The rise and influence of the Roman Senate. Governance. Rome did not run on emperors. It ran on a committee that outlived kings, survived civil wars, negotiated with gods, and invented the political filibuster by staring at birds. The Roman Senate sat there in a tiered hall, in crisp white tunics with purple stripes, acting like an advisory body while quietly deciding who got armies, who got money, who got a triumph, and who got a one-way ticket to irrelevance. The headlines always belong to Caesars and conquerors. The engine room is that room. The word itself gives the mood. Senatus comes from senex, meaning old man, a board of elders. Just picture it. A lot of seasoned aristocrats whose favorite workout is climbing the steps of the Curia, warmed up with gravitas and armed with precedent. No pollsters, no televised debates, just a centuries-long addiction to process and prestige constructed after 509 Bess, when the last king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, was tossed from power. The Senate had been around, under the kings, as a council of elders. After the monarchy fell, it stayed put and told the new magistrates how Rome would function. That continuity is the trick. Kings end, committees endure. In the very early days, tradition says the Senate had 100 members under Rome's first king, and later 300 under later kings like Tarquinius Priscus or Servius Tullius. The numbers are legendary, but the pattern is real. By the early Republic, it settled around 300. It started patrician heavy, those ancient lineages that traced back to myth and had last names like they came with marble fixtures. But over the 5th and 4th centuries, plebeian nobility muscled in. The story of the Roman Senate is the story of slow admission, fierce gatekeeping, and relentless adaptation. So, how did a supposedly advisory body end up directing an empire that, by 117 C under Trajan, stretched across about 5 million square kilometers? It did not happen all at once. It was legal judo mixed with social engineering. The first move was surviving the transition from kings to consuls. 2 consuls replaced the king. The Senate guided them, not by issuing laws at first, but by offering advice that no one dared ignore. Those decisions were not laws. They were senatus, consulta. In theory, just opinions. In practice, the difference between we strongly advise and we decide came down to who controlled the money, religious authority, and the calendar. The Senate held the purse at the areum, the state treasury housed under the temple of Saturn. When a consul wanted to pay legions, buy grain, or expand a road, the keys to the cash were effectively in the Senate's hands through the quaestors. Advisory became mandatory when it touched payroll. Then came the long fight called the conflict of the orders. Starting in 494 BS, the plebs walked out of the city in a mass strike, literally camping on a hill outside Rome, until the system granted them a voice. The result was the tribunate of the plebs, sacrosanct officials who could veto magistrates and defend citizens from arbitrary power. The 12 tables arrived in 400 and 449 Betch, Rome's first public written law code, posted so the old families could not manipulate secret law like a monopoly cheat. Every Roman law student in late Republican oratory class still referenced those bronze tables. This is the era where Rome separated ceremony from rules. By 339 B, the Lex Publilia forced the Senate to give its assent to proposed laws before they were put to the Assembly, preventing after-the-fact sabotage. In 287 B, the Lex Hortensius said that resolutions passed by the plebeian council, plebiscites, had the force of law over everyone. Theoretically, the people had the last word. Practically, the Senate curated what counted as a good idea and what even made it to a vote. A 3rd century Bass reform, the Lex Orvinia, is key. It gave the censors the power to select and regulate senatorial membership, formalizing a list called the Album Senatorium. That is how a club becomes an institution. The roster mattered. The order of speaking mattered. Even the privilege of speaking first mattered, which belonged to the Princeps Senatus, the most senior, authoritative senator chosen by the censors. When Appius Claudius Caecus held that role in the late 4th and early 3rd century Bass, he used it to shape debates with the confidence of a seasoned talk show host who always gets the first mic. The Senate preferred system to spectacle. It ran on mos maiorum, the unwritten code of the ancestors, which roughly translates to, "This is how it is done because the old guys did it this way." It sounds soft, but precedent ruled harder than statute. A senator violated custom. He lost face. He lost face. He lost elections, allies, and maybe a court case. Political capital in Rome had a Latin name, Auctoritas. The Senate embodied it. What exactly did this body do? Picture function after function, stockpiled under one roof. Finances. The Senate directed the Arium Saturni, oversaw tax farming contracts through the censors, and set budgets for armies and public works. It could stall a war by withholding funds, or speed it up by allocating grain and pay. Bronze coins in the early empire even carried the letter Stark, Senatus Consulto, to indicate that the Senate authorized the issue, especially on bronze denominations. That imprint turned committee sentiment into metal. War and diplomacy. The assemblies technically declared war, but the Senate orchestrated everything around it. Assignments for consuls and praetors, to provinces, the number of legions levied, the extension of a command beyond a term, prorogation, the dispatch of embassies to kings, the decision to grant a triumph. Polybius, writing in the mid-2 and 10th century Bars, flatly says the Senate controlled the public purse and foreign policy, and he admired that balance because he came from a Greek world where city-states could not stop eating themselves. Religion. The Senate consulted the Sibylline books, the prophetic texts guarded first by 2, then 10, then 15 priests. When prodigies occurred, Livy records prodigies like showers of stones, talking animals or blood rain being dealt with in committee by sending offerings or importing cults, such as the worship of the Magna Mater in 204 BS. Rome took omens seriously. The Senate also used religion like procedural judo. If an unfavorable omen appeared or was reported by the augurs, meetings could be adjourned. Thunder could end a vote. A flash of lightning worked like a procedural veto with a divine signature. No single law ever created Roman martial law, but the Senate improvised a phrase that changed the game. The Senatus Consultum Ultimo, first recorded in 121 B against Gaius Gracchus. It declared that the consuls should see to it that the state suffered no harm, not a formal suspension of law, but a deadly hint that due process could be adjusted. Cicero invoked it in 63 BS against the Catilinarian conspiracy. Opponents argued it still had to respect the right of provocatio, the right of appeal to the people, guaranteed by laws like the Lex Valeria. That legal tension fueled some of Rome's ugliest days. Now the vibe of the room. Senators wore a tunic with a wide purple stripe, the latus clavus. They sat arranged by seniority. Speakers stood or stayed seated, depending on custom and the presiding magistrate. If a tribune of the plebs sat on his bench by the door and said veto, everything froze. Voting happened by physically separating into side groups, dissessio, and the scribes recorded it. The meeting places shifted. The curia hostilia served for centuries until the funeral of the populist tribune, Publius Clodius, in 52 BS turned into a riot that burned the curia to the ground. For a while they met in Pompey's theatre complex. Julius Caesar would begin constructing a new Senate house, the Curia Julia, which Augustus dedicated in 29 BS. That building still stands on the Roman Forum floor plan today, later converted into the Church of Sant'Adriano in the 7th century. Rome's committee rooms have excellent real estate. When the Mediterranean pivoted in 264, 146 BS, the Senate became an empire's nervous system. Sicily became Rome's first province in 241 BAS after the First Punic War. Sardinia-Corsica followed in 237 BAS. Hispania Citerior and Ulterior were carved out in 197 B. Macedonia and Africa arrived in 146 Buff after the Third Macedonian War and the fall of Carthage. Asia fell into Roman lap in 129 Bas after the will of the Pergamene king. Atulus III. Syria joined in 64 Bes. After Pompey's settlement, more would come. Provinces multiplied. Proconsuls and propraetors governed with imperium. But the Senate decided who went where, how many legions they got, how long they stayed, and what their budgets looked like. The House Committee for Empire Management was literally the House. When disaster struck, the Senate calibrated Roman adrenaline. After Cannae in 216 Bas, when Hannibal annihilated roughly 50,000 to 70,000 Romans and allies in a single day, Livy describes a Senate that refused to sink. They ordered that widows should not display extravagant mourning because the city needed stoicism. They rejected a ransom for Roman prisoners to avoid rewarding Carthage's victory and to discourage surrender in future battles. They had slaves bought, armed, and enrolled as a special corps. Livy gives the number as about 8,700 to 12,000. They sent Quintus Fabius Maximus back to his slow, hovering strategy, refusing to fight pitched battles when it did not favor them. No rage tweeting, no palace coup. They defaulted to process, because that is how an aristocracy survives the worst day in its national memory. The Senate loved to police morals when the empire grew rich. The Lex Claudia of 218 Bas prohibited senators and their sons from owning large seagoing ships, those over 300 amphorae capacity, so the senatorial class stayed land-based and did not turn into merchant princes. Farming estates and rents were acceptable. Bulk commercial profiteering was not. That separation between senators and businessmen produced the equestrian order, the equites, the moneyed class, with a property qualification that hovered around 400,000 sesterces. Jurors in the extortion court swung back and forth between senators and equites depending on the political reform of the day, because balancing elite interests is the Roman version of weather. Religion offered a different glimpse of senatorial power. In 186 Bas, the Senate cracked down on the Bacchanalia, a spread of ecstatic mystery rites of Bacchus. An actual bronze tablet, found near Banzi in southern Italy, preserves the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus. It is specific. No Bacchic meetings unless approved by a praetor in Rome. No gathering with more than 5 people without permission. No man to be a priest. The Senate was not banning a god. It was reasserting control over networks that could produce rival loyalties and nighttime plotting. Polybius and Livy both connect the event with social anxiety. Rome loved religion when it was supervised. For all that control, the Senate never owned the constitution alone. The assemblies had the legal sovereignty. Tribunes had the veto. That caused a collision the minute land, army veterans, and cash arrived as political dynamite in the 2nd century Bas. In 133 BC, Tiberius Gracchus, a tribune of the plebs, pushed through a law, Lex Sempronia Agraria, to enforce limits that already existed on public land holdings and redistribute to poor citizens. The Senate hated it, not because land redistribution was new, but because Tiberius bypassed them and used the people as his base. He even deposed a fellow tribune, Marcus Octavius, who blocked him, an unheard-of move that violated traditions of mutual veto. Tiberius then aimed for a 2nd consecutive tribunate. In Rome, immediate re-election to that office looked like Caesar cosplay. The Senate, led by Pontifex Maximus and Senator Publius Scipio Nasica, formed a posse and killed Tiberius and many supporters near the Temple of Jupiter in 133b. No trial, no pretense. Cicero later tried to argue that the people's sovereignty remained intact, but the scene looked like elites bludgeoning a political rival. In 121 buys, Gaius Gracchus, Tiberius's brother, met a similar wall. He had been even more ambitious with reforms, founding colonies, subsidizing grain, and adjusting juries in extortion courts to favor equites. When events spiraled after a violent rally, the Senate issued the first recorded Senatus Consultum Ultimum. The consul Lucius Opimius organized an armed intervention. Gaius died, and around 3,000 of his supporters were executed. Opimius was later put on trial, but acquitted. The Senate had invented a new tone for crisis management that mixed legality with blunt force and baptized it as a defense of the state. Sallust, a historian writing later, would paint it as the mask of a political elite stressed by money and power. The Senate's control ebbed and flowed as new men walked into the club of 300 with ambitions and armies. The Juguthine War in Numidia around the 110 S100 bis exposed rot. Jugurtha bribed senators. Sallust records Jugurtha allegedly sneering that Rome was a city for sale. Gaius Marius used that scandal to run as a new man candidate, blasting senatorial incompetence and winning the consulship in 107b. He scrambled the cursus honorum, that orderly ladder of offices set by the Lex Vilia Annalis of 180 by, which required ages like roughly 30 for quaestor, 39 for praetor, 42 for consul. Ambition found openings where law met crisis. The Senate could slow, but could not stop. A man who blended populist rhetoric with military results. That dynamic repeats like a motif. Another humiliation hit in 67 Bess. Piracy had become so rampant that grain supplies faltered. The Senate hesitated to give any single man huge, empire-wide command. The Assembly passed the Lex Gabinia anyway, boosting Pompey with an extraordinary 3-year command against pirates across the entire Mediterranean and up to 50 miles inland. Appian reports he received 500 ships, 120,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry, and 24 legates. Pompey divided the sea into 13 districts, cleared the western half in 40 days, then the eastern half in another 49, and resettled pirates inland. He gave Rome cheap bread and safe sea lanes in under 3 months. The Senate looked cautious, even small. The people looked at results and cheered. Cicero, later, would praise Pompey with that classic orator's blend of anxiety and approval. The next year, in 66 Bars, the Lex Manilia handed Pompey the war against Mithridates V of Pontus. Lucullus had been grinding it down for years. The Senate preferred to rotate command, but the crowd loved efficiency and fame. Legendary competence beat procedure. The Senate hated the precedent, not because it was bad policy, but because it normalized the handing out of massive imperium by popular vote. That habit would sink the Republic. The Senate staged its last procedural masterclass in 63 base during the Catilinarian conspiracy. Lucius Sergius Catilina plotted to overthrow the state after failing to win the consulship. Cicero, as consul, announced the conspiracy in the Senate, delivered the famous speeches, and used the Senatus Consultum Ultimum to arrest conspirators in Rome. The debate on their punishment is one for political theory classes. Julius Caesar argued for life imprisonment, respecting the right of appeal. Cato, the younger, argued for execution as a wartime measure. The Senate chose death. Cicero had them executed without a trial. and would later be exiled in 58 Beach for executing citizens without appeal. The Senate saved the city and torched a civil liberty. It called this balance. Then Sulla happened. The Senate had been punked by populist tribunates and charismatic generals. Lucius Cornelius Sulla walked into Rome with armies twice, in 88 Bess and 83 Bess, winning the civil war. As dictator legibus scribundis et rea publi constituende, dictator for writing laws and reordering the state, Sulla re-engineered the machine. He increased the Senate to about 600 members, expanded the number of quaestors to 20 and praetors to 8 or more, and required that magistrates pass through these offices to enter the Senate. He stripped tribunes of most powers and barred ex-tribunes from holding further magistracies. He restored jury service in the permanent criminal courts to senators, taking it from the equites, threw a wave of prescriptions, published lists of enemies outlawed and often killed. He also eliminated rivals and confiscated property to reward friends. Not exactly collegial, Sulla's blueprint was a senatorial oligarchy reinforced by law. It lasted roughly a decade after his death in 78 Beat. Pompey and Crassus undid parts of it in 70 Barch, restoring tribunes' powers and mixing juries again. Once again, a committee had built a fence that a new round of ambitious men kicked down. Julius Caesar then pushed the pattern to its logical conclusion. He received a 5-year command in Gaul in 58 by the Lex Vitinia, extended to 10 years. He conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon in 49 base against the Senate's orders. There was an skew invoked, but the command and counter-command dance had turned into a blame game and won a civil war. He sat as dictator, first for a limited term, then dictator perpetua in 44 Bess. He expanded the Senate to roughly 900 members, packing it with loyalists and provincials. Elite families sneered at the dilution of quality. Caesar called it necessary modernization. The Curia Hostilia was already gone, so the Senate met in Pompey's Curia when Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March 44 Bar. A lot of senators participated in that murder. Brutus, Cassius, and others, motivated by a belief that the old order could be restored if the bodyguard of one man was removed. The motion met reality. The result was more civil war. Octavian, later Augustus, refined the trick. He did not destroy the Senate. He remodeled it in 27 Bars, and again in 23 B, the so-called constitutional settlements. He claimed to restore the Republic, while keeping for himself an imperium maius and tribunicia potestas. The Senate retained prestigious functions. It had 600 members after he carefully purged it and then recruited suitable elites. It governed senatorial provinces like Asia, Africa Proconsularis, Achaia, Sicily, Cyprus, Bithynia Pontus, and others. These provinces had no legions. The emperor kept the imperial provinces with legions, like Syria, Egypt, and the Rhine and Danube frontiers. The Senate continued to vote honors, decree public holidays, manage some finances through the areum, and run urban life. Yet the emperor had his own treasury, the fiscus, and an army oath that ran to him, not the Senate. Prestige stayed in the Curia. Power lived in the Palatine. Augustus also built a moral and property fence around senators. A senatorial property qualification of 1 million sesterces locked the elite class. He banned senators from direct involvement in provincial tax farming and large-scale businesses. He offered stipends to help maintain dignity if a good man lacked cash. He enforced marriage and childbearing incentives that affected senators, penalizing those who refused to marry or produce legitimate heirs. A ruling elite could look clean and official, but the emperor still picked the reality. Tiberius, emperor, from 14 to 37c, treated the Senate as a serious partner, even conducting trials and elections through it. He moved the election of magistrates from the popular assemblies into the Senate, which turned voting into a less sweaty, more controlled affair. Tacitus paints Tiberius as passive-aggressive, with senators nervously inferring his wishes. Treason trials grew in frequency under the Lex Majestatis, and the Senate sat as court. For many of them, prestige can feel like sitting at the head of a table, while the chef runs the kitchen. Claudius in 48c performed one of the Senate's more audacious makeovers by admitting Gallic elites, specifically from the Aedui, into the Senate. The Tabula Lugdunensis preserves parts of his speech, where he argues that Rome had long recruited from Italy and beyond, and that Gaul had proved loyal. The move enraged some old guard senators, but history sided with these decisions. If the empire was to function, provincial elites needed pathways to real inclusion. The Senate, as a brand, extended beyond Latium and the Appian Way. Under the High Empire, the Senate remained the club that produced city magistrates, provincial governors in peaceful areas, and the urban prefect. Under Trajan and Hadrian, roughly 138, it could feel respected. Trajan addressed the Senate. Hadrian toured provinces and respected legal forms. A senator's last act might be to govern Asia or Africa for a year and then retire to examine his garden and correspond with Pliny. That is the good news version. The bad news arrives in the 3rd century crisis. Military barracks, emperors rose and fell, with legionary fortunes. The Senate declared Plumius and Balbinus emperors in 238, c. after the death of Maximinus Thrax, but the Praetorian Guard killed them. The Senate's last bluff as kingmaker ended with blood on the marble. The Senate in Rome had a twin by then. Constantine founded a new Senate in Constantinople in 330 CE, equipping it with ranks and honors. Both bodies increasingly managed municipal and judicial matters rather than empire-wide policy. By the late 4th and early 5th centuries, senators in Rome were wealthy aristocrats who managed the city's grain supply, built churches as well as temples turned churches, and tried to watch the city survive Visigoths in 410 and Vandals in 455. The Senate sent delegations to negotiate with invaders and emperors. In 476, the Senate cooperated when the general Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople. The Senate still mattered as a prestige body even in the age of non-Roman kings. Boethius, a senator, wrote philosophy while imprisoned by Theodoric the Great in the early 6th century. Executed in 524. The Curia Julia was converted into the Church of Sant'Adriano by Pope Honorius I between 625 and 638. The Senate, as a political actor, dwindled into a municipal council. References to senatorial decrees fade after the early 7th century. The spore stamped on manhole covers in modern Rome is the ghost of a system that once ran the known world. The myths around the Senate are sticky for a reason. The myth says that it was an all-powerful aristocratic cabal that strangled popular freedom. Another myth says it was a noble, deliberative assembly that stabilized a republic until it was murdered by tyrants. The reality patents messiness. It was both restraining and self-serving. Cicero himself vacillated between praising the Senate as the guardian of the state and admitting that greed and status often drove it into moral potholes. He did his speeches in that building, then wrote to friends complaining about colleagues. Elite hypocrisy is not an invention of cable news. A myth also lives in the idea that the Senate declared war and wrote laws like a modern parliament. In Roman constitutional machinery, the comitia voted laws and declared war. The Senate shaped that decision by controlling money, ritual, and who got to chair the debate. It felt like rule without being seen to rule. There is strategic genius in being the second signature on every decision. Another myth insists the Senate was monolithically patrician into late times. By the 3rd century B, the conflict of the orders had produced a mixed elite class. Plebeian nobility had entwined with patricians through office holding and marriage. The long list of consuls with new names in the 2nd and 1st centuries shows the entry of families that were once outsiders. Rome loved a new man if he spoke Latin, like an orator, and donated spectacles. The Senate loved him once. He became predictable. One more myth suggests the Senate died with Caesar. The Senate, battered and changed, continued as a crucial organ of state and to Augustus and his successors. Tacitus opens his annals with the observation that power had moved to the emperor, while the Senate had the semblance of old authority. Semblance matters in a system built on prestige, rituals, and honors. Senators still governed Asia, Africa, and Achaia. They still judged major legal cases. They still staged public ceremonies. The fact that they had to guess an emperor's wishes does not make them mannequins. Zooming into the architecture of governance explains how long this machine lasted. Start with the cursus honorum, the ladder. A young aristocrat might begin as a military tribune in his teens, then aim to be quaestor in his early 30s. The lex vilia annalis anchored age minima, roughly 30 for quaestor, mid-30s for aedile, around 39 for praetor, and at least 42 for consul. After quaestorship, he entered the Senate. He could be an aedile, responsible for markets and games, or skip it. A praetor could lead armies and preside over courts. A consul led the state. After that, he returned as proconsul of a province for a year or more. The Senate managed this traffic. It decreed whether provinces went by lot, sortitio, or by direct assignment, comparatio. It decided whether a command ended or got extended. It watched the pairings, like a parent handing out car keys to two sons with a history of crashing. A governor's moral job description looked noble. Justice, security, and taxation administered fairly. The reality included a parade of temptations. Enter the quaestio de repetundis, the extortion court for provincial misdeeds. Who sat on the jury mattered. In 122 bus, Gaius Gracchus had juries staffed by equites to counter senatorial cover-ups. Sulla in the 80s bus restored juries to the Senate, which predictably was kinder to its own. Pompey and Crassus in 70 bis blended juries again. The political compromise played out in courtroom Latin. Grain and public works added drama. The Senate controlled the grain supply for Rome through annona policies under the Republic via extraordinary prefects in times of crisis, and under the Empire with the permanent praefectus anon. When there was famine, senators feared riots. When Gaius Gracchus introduced a grain subsidy, the Senate saw it as a way for tribunes to buy votes, but also a necessary urban policy. The building of roads, aqueducts, and temples ran on senatorial oversight. Censors signed contracts for public works every 5 years during the lustrum. The Aqua Marcia in 144 Bess, for example, delivered water across 91 kilometers to Rome, and senators had a say through the censors and oversight committees. Public works were a place to look pious and gain credit. Triumphs were the Senate's Oscars. A general requested a triumph after a successful campaign, and the Senate voted yes or no. Criteria existed, often massaged: a required number of enemy dead, territory captured, or a formal war ended. When the Senate denied a full triumph, It sometimes granted an ovation, a lesser parade where the general walked on foot and wore a myrtle crown instead of a laurel. The Senate used triumph votes to reward loyalty or make a point about overreach. In 63 BS, Pompey got a spectacular third triumph for his eastern campaigns that included display of captured kings and enormous treasure. Spectacle sells influence. Religion underpinned everything. The Senate's power to consult the Sibylline books meant it could propose importing foreign cults as cures to prodigies. The Magna Mater's arrival from Pessinus in 204 BA, a meteorite considered the goddess herself, was a Senate-managed public event. The Senate could suppress cults it found suspicious, regulate priestly colleges, and declare public holidays. The Roman calendar was politics by other means. When the body decided that feriae were needed, that changed workdays and legal business. That sensitivity to days and omens meant senators could delay votes if a thunderclap sounded. The augur's announcement of a bad omen acted like a Supreme Court injunction delivered via the sky. The Senate's ancient prerogatives blended with modernizing moves under Augustus. He created the aerarium militare in 6, an imperial military treasury for veterans' pensions, funded by a 5% inheritance tax, vicesima hereditatium, and a 1% sales tax on auctions. The Senate still oversaw the traditional aerium saturni at first, but the emperor's treasury, the fiscus, now dwarfed it. Money drifted away from the curia to the palace, yet even emperors needed the Senate's aura. Augustus had the Senate pass decrees that formalized his powers, even while those powers were essentially permanent. The Senate conferred the title Augustus in 27 base. It voted him an honorific shield, the Clupius Virtutis, for valor, clemency, justice, and piety. Statues of him bearing that shield broadcast the Senate's endorsement, like a public relations victory lap. Later, emperors used and abused the Senate to taste. Nero performed on stage and treated senators like dramaturgs. Vespasian rebuilt the economy after 69, seized civil war, and like Senate backing for stability. Domitian micromanaged and terrified the Senate, executing members for treason. Trajan became the model of an emperor who respected the Senate, at least in letters. Pliny's correspondence as governor of Bithynia Pontus, around 112 C shows a governor writing to the emperor on small administrative matters, while still acknowledging senatorial norms. Tacitus complains that senatorial debate had become a performance with a foregone conclusion. The show must go on. Military crises rewrote the playbooks. In 235-284 CE, more than 20 emperors reigned in 50 years. The famous 3rd century crisis, Goths, Persians, and internal rebellions ripped the empire. The Senate could still declare an emperor in Rome, but the legions decided who wore the purple. Aurelian and Diocletian restructured everything to survive. Diocletian formalized the dominate, an open autocracy with elaborate ritual, the emperor as dominus, lord. The Senate did not vanish, but high command moved to military men across the provinces. The Roman Senate became a symbol of the city rather than the empire. Constantine finessed the arrangement by building a new Senate in his new capital, Constantinople, around 330 C. That new Senate housed imperial elites in the east, and its prestige grew as Constantinople did. 2 senates now existed, both composed of aristocrats managing pomp, appointments, and local administration more than destinies of armies. Still, the Senate found ways to be relevant. In the late 4th and early 5th centuries, the Roman Senate negotiated with emperors over pagan rituals and Christian conversions. Quintus Aurelius Symmachus, an urban prefect and senator, famously pleaded in the 380s for the restoration of the altar of victory in the Senate House, arguing for religious pluralism and tradition. Ambrose of Milan shut that down with bishop-level energy. The Senate made arguments. Bishops and emperors made final calls. Old governance met new faith. By the time Gothic and Vandal kings walked through the city, the Senate managed what it could. It sent Leo the Great to persuade Attila in 452 and tried to mitigate the Vandal sack in 455. When Odoacer took power in 476, the Senate delivered the imperial insignia to Zeno in Constantinople and asked to govern Italy under Odoacer. The Senate worked for Theoderic, the Ostrogoth, under a form of coexistence that preserved Roman law and elite status. Boethius and Cassiodorus, senators with big brains, wrote philosophical and administrative treatises. That too came to blood. Boethius died a political prisoner in 534 after Gothic wars began to ravage Italy. The Senate's importance shrank further. The Curia Julia's conversion into a church, under Pope Honorius I in the 7th century, marks the official furniture going ecclesiastical. Senators became aristocrats of memory rather than policy. The Senate's governance can be summed up in one Roman word that never truly translates: auctoritas. It is not formal law. It is not force. It is the social voltage that runs through reputations. The Senate concentrated auctoritas, then used it to steer budgets, armies, and rituals. That energy even survived regime change. Sulla tried to hardwire it into law. Caesar mocked its limits and stacked the room. Augustus repackaged it with new labels. Tiberius, Claudius, and Trajan gave it a long leash when convenient. Domitian yanked it short. Late emperors carried it around like a ceremonial sword and handed it to bishops as needed. So the tricks and tools of this committee deserve a close read. It played long games with personnel. Censors policed senators' ranks every 5 years, controlling membership. They could degrade a senator for moral failings, remove his name from the roll, and thus end his public career. Appius Claudius Caecus, as censor in 312 BIs, famously enrolled new men into the Senate, took votes away from entrenched elites in tribal assemblies, and built the Via Appia and Aqua Appia. A censor's choices altered the texture of speeches decades later. This is human resource management with a marble forum. As the break room, it controlled time. The Senate declared Senatus Consulta that triggered calendars of rituals and legal windows. If prodigies occurred, say, a statue wept or a child was born with 2 heads, reports went to the Senate. The Decemviri or Quindecimviri opened the Sibylline books, lines of Greek verse that no one fully understood, but everyone feared, and decreed remedies like fasting, ceremonies, or the introduction of foreign cults. Silence could be enforced by ritual. War could be stalled by omens. Any student of parliamentary procedure will recognize ancient foot-dragging, dressed in a long tunic. It controlled honor. A triumph made a career. A special curule, chair, laurel crown, and a parade. The Senate granted it or refused it, denying a triumph to a too popular general who sat uneasily with the aristocracy happened more than once. Cato once fought hard against giving excessive honors to generals he distrusted, including resisting Scipio Africanus's demands for resources. The Senate allowed Scipio to take command in Spain at about age 26 in 210 bis Term, and about age and because of desperation after Hannibal's hammering, and because Scipio promised results. Scipio delivered on both Spain and later Africa. The Senate tried to keep Scipio's fame in bounds. he retired early. Others would not. It controlled access. Meetings took place in spaces marked as temple zones. Not all were allowed in. Tribunes sat near the door as guardians of the people. They were sacrosanct. Anyone who laid hands on them could be killed according to old omens and laws. That threat was mostly mythical by the 2nd century BOS, but it shadowed debates. A tribune's veto could freeze legislative business. The Senate had to persuade, not just order, and when persuasion failed, it had to rally other magistrates. This is why Rome generated orators as a crop. Cato, the Gracchi, Cicero. Governance was rhetorical wrestling. It also learned that legions change everything. The Senate did not command armies directly. Consuls and praetors did. Governors did. But the Senate assigned and funded those armies and approved the military oath. The sacramentum. Soldiers swore to obey their general, not the Senate, as a body. That distinction was fatal in the late Republic. Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, once their legions loved them more than they loved institutions. The Senate's old leverage felt like a polite letter. Cicero could thunder that the Republic was a shared body. Caesar's soldiers carried a crown of laurel on the prows of their ships and crossed a small Italian river as if crossing a constitutional Rubicon, which they did. He kept his committees alive by turning rivals into allies when possible. After murmurs of civil war, the Senate sometimes brokered compromise. The famous, or infamous, First Triumvirate in 60 BICE between Caesar, Pompey and Crassus was not a formal commission of the state, but the Senate's inflexibility helped birth it. Caesar agreed to back Pompey's eastern settlements and Crassus' financial interests. They backed his agrarian law and provincial command. The Senate got sidelined because it told its most ambitious men to calm down instead of bribing them with honors. Rome preferred bribery to intransigence. Rome's big men preferred no friction at all. By the early empire, the Senate became a high court for treason and other crimes. Famous trials give the courtroom channel its ratings. Under Tiberius, the trial of Cremutius Cordus for praising Brutus and calling Cassius, the last of the Romans, ended with Cordus' suicide and the burning of his books, only for the works to be preserved by friends. A Senate that had once weighed wars now weighed words. Under Nero, Petronius, the purported author of the Satyricon and a man of taste, was forced to commit suicide after being accused of disloyalty. He slashed his wrists and bandaged them, and unbandaged them during a final party, a Roman version of gallows staging. The Senate issued the decrees around these deaths. Performance replaced policy. Then the pendulum. Vespasian and Titus rebuilt a working relationship between emperor and Senate after 69C's year of the 4 emperors. The Flavians funded building projects, including the Colosseum, with war spoils and taxation. Senators resumed their roles in governing peaceful provinces. Pliny the Younger's letters under Trajan show him dutifully asking the emperor whether to build a bathhouse, handle corrupt contractors, and set admission prices for certain civic events. Governors in senatorial provinces wrote to the emperor about details the Senate once would have handled. It looked like bureaucracy spreading roots. The Senate even managed symbols that endured beyond politics. Spercoa, Senatus Populesque Romanus, appeared on inscriptions, standards, and buildings. It meant the Senate and the Roman people. Not just a motto, a constitutional theology. Together, they ruled. In reality, the balance oscillated. Sometimes the Senate rode shotgun, sometimes the back seat, but the letters stayed. They stayed on manhole covers in modern Rome, because Rome never throws away its brands. The Senate's influence shows in things people cannot stop doing, even after the power is gone. In late antiquity, the senatorial aristocracy still staged lavish games, restored fonts and basilicas, and competed in philanthropy. In the 370s, 380s, Symmachus and his circle wrote letters that sound like social media for the late Roman elite, gossiping about appointments, pleading for favors, and bragging about estates. The Senate's currency, connections, out-survived its control. The nitty-gritty of how senators lived rounds out the picture. A senator wore a tunic with a broad purple stripe and shoes with moon-shaped ornaments. He could not marry a freedwoman under Augustus's marriage laws. He could not do bulk trade. He could own enormous land, run villas that produced olive oil and wine, and lease out tax farming rights to equestrian syndicates. He could sponsor games. He had to show up. Augustus imposed attendance rules. Senators who skipped too many sessions faced fines or public shaming. The Curia had attendance like a modern board meeting with a stern chair. Busy imperial schedules, or lack of interest, were not excuses unless an emperor was watching. Members entered the Senate via the quaestorship. Julius Caesar expanded the number of quaestors. Augustus trimmed membership back to 600 and made sure the quality improved, sometimes staging purges in 29 Bess and later. The Princeps Senatus regained cachet under Augustus. Men like Marcus Valerius Messala Corvinus held the post and spoke first in debates. It meant something. The voice that sets the tone, sets the outcome. Case studies spike the story. Take the Bacchanalia crackdown again. The surviving bronze tablet from 186 Bars includes lines such as Neci senatum discernere, ubiat bacchanal haber, and lays down that if someone asked permission to hold a bacchanalia, the Senate would debate it with 100 senators present and then allow it only if the praetor urbanus supervised. That 100 senator quorum proved the Senate wanted any exception to look serious. A committee wrote itself into religious life line by line. Control is not always brute force. Sometimes it is paperwork. Consider triumphs and no triumphs. Lucullus did brilliant work against Mithridates, reorganized Asia Minor, controlled a chaotic frontier, and got undercut by a narrative of self-indulgence and troops' discontent. He returned with less than he felt he deserved. The Senate's judgment on a triumph or an ovation became a public-facing review. A bad review could sink a memoir. In Rome, it could end a faction or a legacy. Pompey had 3 full triumphs, a record. Caesar paraded in 46 Bars, not once, but 4 times over Gaul, Egypt, Pontus, and Africa, crowning it with the famous line, Veni, 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 47 Bars. The Senate cheered and grimaced. They watched the Republic turn into a runway. The Senate's emergency decree, the skew, casts a long legal shadow. It appears again in 100 Bars, against the tribune Saturninus, in 88 Bars, during Sulpicius Rufus riots, and in 63 Bars, with Catiline. In each use, senators aimed to replace trial with command. Cicero's later exile for executing citizens under the sky shows the legal boomerang. Rome lived with laws and counters. The Senate found itself wielding a scalpel in a riot and getting sued with it later. Membership churn shows the Senate's immune system. Sulla added hundreds of men, many from the Italian municipal elites. Caesar added more, including provincial notables from Gaul and beyond. Augustus cut the list to 600, staging reviews where senators had to demonstrate their rank and property. Some resigned gracefully. Others were dropped and embarrassed. Augustus even offered cash to some to maintain the property threshold. He wanted dignity without poverty, showcasing the odd economics of Roman elitism. Poverty in a senator looked like a betrayal of the brand. Provincial management matured. Senatorial provinces were governed by proconsuls, appointed usually for 1 year. Asia and Africa were the prizes. Peaceful, wealthy, prestigious. An ex-consul might govern Africa. An ex-praetor might govern a smaller province, like Bithynia Pontus. Governors had legates and staff. The Senate passed decrees that regulated their behavior. The Lex Cornelia de Repetendis, and later laws itemized what gifts and fees were illegal. Pliny's letters show him obsessing over contracts, theatre seats, and aqueduct repairs. He asked Trajan how to handle a fire brigade in Nicomedia, because associations could become political clubs. Trajan refused permission, fearing political clubs more than fires. The Senate would understand. Every Roman knows that a fire brigade can turn into a faction. The Senate's relationship with popular assemblies is the most misunderstood part of Roman governance. The Comitia Centuriata, organized by wealth and centuries, elected consuls and praetors and voted on war. The Comitia Tributa, organized by tribes, elected lower magistrates and passed laws. The Concilium Plebis, the plebeian council, elected tribunes and passed plebiscites. The Senate often pre-approved measures and shepherded them through. After 339 Ba, the Senate's acta returse had to be given before a measure went to the people. After 287 Ba, the people's decision bound everyone. This means the Senate did not own the Constitution, but it owned the process that fed it. The Senate is the committee that set the agenda. The Senate, as brand, had a clear look. The Curia's interior was austere. Marble steps framed an open central space. Bronze doors reflected light. Statues of famous men lined niches. The imagines, the ancestral wax masks used in funeral processions, haunted the area, a visual chorus of "do not mess this up." Ritual abounded. Before speaking, a senator might appeal to gods. New magistrates took office, with rituals in the capital. The Senate awarded thanksgivings, supplications after victories. When Caesar was alive, the Senate voted a 4-0 de supplicatio after the victory at Thapsus in 46 Bosch. That was a lot of days of temple visits. Polybius would nod approvingly. The gods matter because they police behavior with lightning. Authority figures who shaped the Senate's myth deserve name checks. Polybius, the Greek historian captured after the sack of Corinth in 146 BY, lived as a hostage in the household of Scipio Aemilianus and became enamored with Roman constitutional balance. His book 6 describes the Senate as the backbone, the consuls as the executive, and the people as the final sovereign. Livy in the Augustan age wrote of Rome's history as a moral drama, with the Senate often as the repository of the Mos Maiorum. Cicero practiced Senate-centered governance in his speeches De Re Publica, Pro Sestio, the Catilinarians. Sallust wrote later that luxury and greed had weakened the Senate since the destruction of Carthage in 146 BY. Tacitus wrote with acid drip about a Senate that had exchanged deliberation for sycophancy under the emperors, though he also shows senators risking their lives to stand up. Mary Beard, in Modern Times, points out how much of the senatorial myth is Roman self-promotion. Fergus Miller showed how deeply public politics ran in Rome, how the people still mattered, even under autocracy. The Senate built its brand with antique and modern prayer. Humor lurks in the sheer absurdity of power rituals. Omens could stop a meeting. An augur, declaring that he heard thunder, turned into a shutdown. A veto from a tribune could happen, because he sat on a bench wrong and said no. Debates could go all day and into night, with the presiding consul threatening to detain senators if they tried to leave for dinner. Sometimes a senator demanded that an enemy be denied a decent burial as punishment. Sometimes a praetor insisted that a slave had spoken in court improperly, staging a procedural meltdown over status. This is not apathy. It is a firm belief that the world runs on signs, ritual, and honor. The most powerful men in the Mediterranean used birds and weather as legal instruments. They also used time as a weapon. The Senate could defer a bill by insisting that a vote wait until full attendance or until a religious holiday passed. The Assembly could go around the Senate if a tribune decided to bring his bill straight to the people. A consul could threaten to declare senatus consultum ultimum. Politics ran on brinkmanship. When a tribune proposed a law, the Senate sometimes did not fight the content. It fought the timing. Rome invented scheduling wars long before calendar apps. On the tangible side, the Senate physically moved money. The Aerarium Saturni stored metal, ingots, coin reserves, public records, and the bronze tablets of laws and treaties. Quaestors opened the treasury with keys and counted out payments for army pay and public projects. Contracts for tax farming, the farming of publicani in provinces like Asia and Gaul, were auctioned off in Rome under the oversight of censors. The Senate listened to complaints about tax collectors overreaching, especially from provinces that learned to write beautifully outraged letters. In 61 Bess, Publius Clodius Pulcher, a young patrician who would become a tribune, insulted the Senate by sneaking into the women-only bona dea rites at Caesar's house, causing an uproar. He was tried, acquitted after influencing the jury, and then used the tribunate to smash Cicero. That is not a tangent. That is the Senate's ecosystem. Ritual, scandal, courtroom, drama, and policy. The Senate also bled on battlefields, not just committee rooms. Senators and their sons served as officers and sometimes died, leading charges. Cannae saw the death of consulars and senators. The Battle of the Allia in 390 Bars, whether the date and details are as Livy says or not, traumatized Roman memory so much that the day became unlucky. Cato the Younger died by suicide in 46 Bess at Utica, rather than submit to Caesar. Senatorial resistance could end as personal tragedy. A special note on the Senate's influence on language. The word senator in later states carries a Roman echo. Even in the United States, the Senate imagines itself as a chamber of restraint and measured deliberation. That self-image originates in Roman texts. The House of Lords in Britain once saw itself as a council of hereditary notables. That is a Roman vibe. City councils in medieval Europe adopted the term senatus for municipal governance. Rome's committee is the prototype for dignified legislative bodies that want both weight and theatre. The Senate, of course, had famous internal villains and heroes depending on taste. Catiline stands as a Senate-loathing aristocrat turned revolutionary. Cicero became the Senate's voice of conscience, and its comedian in one. Cato is the stoic who would rather die than bow. Clodius is the troll who weaponized street gangs and procedure. Caesar is the genius who saw that the Republic's hardware could not handle its software anymore and installed an update that erased the old operating system. Augustus is the tech support guy who made the update look like a restoration and made the old icons open new apps. The Senate is the desktop background everyone recognizes, still visible, rarely in control of the cursor by the end. Specific numbers punctuate the narrative. Around 300 senators in the early and middle Republic. Sulla raised it to about 600 in the 80s Bass. Julius Caesar raised it to around 900 in the 40s Boss. Augustus pared it back to 600 by roughly 18 Betch. and tightened standards. 10 tribunes of the plebs existed by the 4th century Bas, 20 quaestors after Sulla, 8 praetors by Sulla, eventually peaking higher under the empire, 2 consuls every year since 509 Bucks, with rare interruptions when dictators were appointed, which occurred around a dozen times under the Republic before Sulla radicalized it. The Senate assigned 2 consuls, one to manage Italy or specific wars, one to go to a hot province. Numbers create rhythm. Roman debate withstood time, because the Senate trained its speakers in anxious reason. Cicero's rhetorical treatises and speeches, collected in volumes any classicist can quote, like a playlist, teach that persuasion beats compulsion in a mixed constitution. He had to believe that. Because he lacked an army, the Senate embodied that belief. Sensible men argued during daylight, swore by Jupiter, voted, and went home. If only that worked against generals who did not mind using night. In collapsing empires, the Senate remained a service. It handled the city. That meant aqueduct maintenance, road repair, grain distributions, temple, and then church upkeep. Senators like Symmachus financed repairs to the Colosseum after lightning strikes. The Colosseum, opened in 80 was a Flavian project that the Senate loved to use as a showcase. Games gave senators a chance to sponsor for popularity. Later Christian emperors changed the balance, reducing gladiatorial events, but not urban entertainment. Senators pivoted from circus veteran gladiators to chariot races and theatre. The people still needed shows. No one institution in Rome had every lever. The Senate's genius and curse was being the place where levers came to be coordinated. Consuls had imperium. Tribunes had veto. Assemblies had laws. Priests had omens. The Senate had actoritas. Actoritas does not die easily. It seeps into everything. It is why Spear lives on stone and steel. There is a last scene worth visualizing. The Curia Julia in the forum around the 2nd century C, with senators sitting in rows as a herald calls proceedings. The floor shines with marble. The doors stand high and bronze. Outside, the forum buzzes with traders, clients, tourists, and the noise of a city of perhaps 1 million people at its peak. Inside, a debate about whether to grant a 5-day Thanksgiving for a victory in Dacia or a 10-day. Senators weigh how many days will signal appropriate appreciation without cheapening the gesture. The emperor may or may not attend. He might send a statement. The senators speak in order. The princeps senatus first. The final decree gets carved on a bronze tablet and posted. The city wakes the next day and finds that the calendar shifted a little. That is soft power done with marble gravitas. The Senate rose by outlasting kings and channeling social capital into policy. It influenced governance by owning money, ritual, and honor. It adapted under emperors to remain significant. It declined when armies shifted allegiance and emperors centralized. It survived as a municipal aristocracy and a symbol. It still sits as 4 Latin letters on city drains. That is not a fall. That is a fade into infrastructure. Livy, Polybius, Cicero, Sallust, Tacitus, Appian, Suetonius, and modern historians like Mary Beard and Fergus Miller offer the receipts. The Senate is not legend. It is a committee that made itself the center of gravity for half a millennium. The miracle is not that Caesar could ignore it by crossing a river at night. The miracle is that Rome built a board of elders that could withstand that level of ambition for centuries. Without microphones, without cameras, and with a superstition about thunder that doubled as the world's oldest filibuster. But wait, the real legacy lives every time a chamber of notables claims to speak for tradition, points to a long table, and wraps itself in old words to steer new realities. That move began in a room in Rome, where 300, then 600, then 900 men learned to turn advice into government. The emperors look glamorous on statues. The Senate is the reason those emperors had anything to rule. And now, let's continue with our next story. The leadership of Simon Bolivar, Liberator of South America. He dies on a borrowed bed in Santa Marta on the 17th of December 1830. Lungs wrecked, pockets almost empty, a trunk of papers beside him, and a country called Gran Colombia, dissolving like a sandcastle in a storm. The guy who engraved Liberator into 6 national seals checks out of life, practically stateless. That exit sets the tone. Simon Bolivar's leadership reads less like a marble statue and more like a decade-long sprint through chaos with a pen in one hand and a saber in the other, while juggling egos, armies, and a political philosophy that had to evolve in real time or get crushed under Spanish cavalry. The origin story refuses to stay tidy. He's born in Caracas on the 24th of July, 1783, into money that came from cacao, mines, and enslaved labor. This matters because he knows privilege, yet he also knows loss. His father dies when he's 2. His mother dies when he's 9. The boy's guardians hire tutors who leave fingerprints on his brain. Simon Rodriguez cracks open Rousseau and the social contract. Andrés Bello demonstrates how ideas travel across oceans and become tools. Young Bolivar learns early that books can be weaponized. Europe adds the steel. In 1802, he marries Maria Teresa Rodriguez del Toro y Aleza in Madrid, brings her home to Caracas, and loses her to yellow fever within months. That grief turns volcanic. Then he witnesses Napoleon's coronation in December 1804, self-crowning in Notre Dame, royal pageantry with revolutionary residue. By 1805, on a hill above Rome called Monte Sacro, he makes a vow to dedicate his life to American independence. The wording gets romanticized later, but the core is documented in letters and memoirs. He promises a lifetime on this mission. He is 22, rich and stubborn, with Europe's swagger freshly imprinted on his imagination. He returns to Caracas as history accelerates. The French invade Spain in 1808. The Spanish king abdicates. Legitimacy in the empire turns into philosophical pudding. On the 19th of April, 1810, Caracas pushes the Spanish Captain General aside and forms a junta. Bolivar joins the diplomatic mission to London with Andrés Bello and Luis López Méndez to court British support. He locates Francisco de Miranda, the grizzled veteran who had already tried revolution in 1806. He persuades Miranda to return. That persuasion will boomerang with the precision of a bad life choice. On the 5th of July, 1811, Venezuela declares independence. It's a federal republic on fragile legs, and nature immediately kicks those legs. An earthquake strikes on the 26th of March, 1812, hammering Caracas and other patriot strongholds. Priests aligned with the crown call it divine retribution. The royalist guerrilla leader José Tomás Boves discovers that Llanero horsemen, ignored by Caracas elites for decades, can be weaponized with promises of loot and revenge. Federal bickering fractures the patriot side. Miranda decides capitulation is the only path to avoid massacre. He signs an armistice at San Mateo in July 1812, and Bolivar, enraged at what he views as betrayal, helps arrest Miranda at La Guaira. The future liberator is complicit in delivering his own mentor to Spanish chains. The revolution already eats its elders. Exile sharpens him. He flees to New Granada and writes the Cartagena Manifesto on the 15th of December, 1812. It reads like a diagnosis from a field surgeon. Federalism in a newborn state equals paralysis. Lack of discipline destroys armies. Moral authority and centralized command become non-negotiable. This is the first draft of the Bolivar, who will rule by charisma and decree. The one who prefers institutions that can actually fight rather than daydream about perfect constitutions. The manifesto is both critique and roadmap. New Granada gives him a small force. In 1813, he launches the admirable campaign from Cucuta through Mérida and Trujillo, issuing a document that obliterates his moderate image, the war to the death decree on the 15th of June, 1813. Spaniards who refuse to support independence receive no mercy. Americans who support the crown can seek forgiveness. Peninsular Spaniards, not so much. This is not a footnote. He puts the terror of civil war into legal ink. The decree is brutal and highly publicized. Daniel Florencio O'Leary's later memoirs and contemporary pamphlets make the point clear. It's a psychological sledgehammer meant to counter royalist atrocities. Moral ambiguity becomes a tool of strategy. By the 6th of August, 1813, he enters Caracas. The city confers the title Libertador. The myth machine starts rolling, but reality tightens a noose around it. Boves pours Llanero fury onto the Republic. In 1814, after disasters like La Puerta, Bolivar presides over a desperate civilian evacuation eastward, known as the Emigration Oriente. Thousands fleeing, many dying along the roads. He is 31 and already has the scars of defeat deep in the bone. He abandons Caracas again and sails out, a revolutionary with receipts but no territory. Jamaica becomes the waiting room. In Kingston, he writes the Jamaica Letter on the 6th of September, 1815. It's a long, lucid, economically and politically literate analysis of Spanish America's past and potential future. He predicts multiple nations rather than one huge republic, flags the region's geographic fractures, warns about Cordeos, and begs for British interest. He writes like a head of state without a state. His pen becomes a supply line for future legitimacy. Meanwhile, there's an assassination attempt in Kingston in December 1815, a clumsy nocturnal attack that misses him. The Liberator's bed hosts an assailant's knife, only because he isn't in it. Haiti saves him. Alexandre Pétion, the Haitian president and veteran of a revolution that actually succeeded, gives him ships, arms, printing presses, and money in 1816. Pétion asks for one thing in return: emancipation. Bolivar moves from theory to decree. In June 1816, at Carúpano, he announces freedom for enslaved people who join the Patriot Army and makes emancipation a pillar of his platform. This promise breaks with his class and his past. His family wealth had included enslaved labor. In private, he had manumitted some persons earlier, but this is public and strategic. He is still not a pure abolitionist in the modern sense. What he does is conditional at first, and full abolition becomes a generational project. But the pivot is undeniable. Haiti's leverage changes the moral architecture of his revolution. And the paper trail, the decree itself, later laws in the Congress of Cucuta in 1821 with free WOM provisions, backs this up. He plants his capital in a sweaty, mosquito-loud bend of the Orinoco called Angostura in 1817. The geography speaks like a bouncer. If Caracas can fall, perhaps a river fortress will buy time. He manufactures a state before he fully holds one. He builds a newspaper. He creates ministries. He appoints men who can actually do the job. He pushes discipline hard. He courts the Llaneros through a pact with Jose Antonio Paez, the centaur of Apure, a man who turns horses into infantry-smashing shockwaves. The elite from Caracas had dismissed Llaneros as uncouth. Bolivar shows up in their world, embraces their fight, and lets Paez lead. That partnership, recorded in letters and orders that survive in the Archivo del Libertador, gives the Patriots a decisive edge. His leadership style is mobile and hyperverbal. He rides long and writes longer. Historians estimate more than 10,000 documents bearing his signature survive. Some counts go past 13,000. He dictates letters while on the march. He receives reports at midnight. He micromanages promotions, logistics, even the wording of proclamations. He burns relationships as fast as he builds them. Francisco de Paula Santander becomes his legalist foil in New Granada. Obsessive, procedural, sharp, Juan Antonio José de Sucre emerges as the serene military genius, a man who finishes battles with geometry and mercy. He recruits a foreign legion of hard luck, the British Legion, mostly veterans from the Napoleonic Wars, Irish and English and Scottish soldiers who can't find a paycheck in peacetime, arrives by the hundreds. By 1819, about 1,200 are in the field. Sometimes more, sometimes fewer, depending on mortality and desertion. James Rucoke loses an arm at Vargas and keeps swinging. Daniel Florencio Ulieri becomes Bolivar's Irish memory bank, writing 30-plus volumes later to make sure the record stays stacked in favor of the Liberator. Payment for these soldiers often arrives late, in IOUs and promises of land. Exposure, fever, and slogging through swamps serve as the real payroll. Then comes the Andes. In June-July 1819, he and roughly 2,500 men take the route through the Llano to Por and up the Páramo de Pisba. The cold shatters lungs. The mud eats boots. Sudden snow bleaches the horizon. Men wrap feet in rags and leather scraps. Mules freeze. Some estimates say a third of the force disappears to exposure and disease. By the time they crest the pass, they resemble ghosts. Spanish commanders in New Granada expect offensives only in dry season and only along predictable roads. Surprise becomes a weapon that breathes frost. He slaps the enemy awake at Pantano de Vargas on the 25th of July 1819, where lancers led by one José Rondon break a near defeat with a charge that belongs on every cavalry highlight reel. 2 weeks later at Boyacá, on the 7th of August 1819, the Patriots cut the Spanish retreat at the bridge over the Tetenos River. The battle lasts a couple hours, kills hundreds, captures thousands, and breaks the spine of royalist control in New Granada. Bogotá falls without a fight. Silver in the treasury becomes patriot payroll, and the revolution suddenly owns a capital. He formalizes ambitions, because paper can stabilize saber victories. On the 17th of December 1819, he gets the Congress at Angostura to create the Republic of Colombia, better known today as Gran Colombia, combining Venezuela and New Granada, later to include Quito. The Angostura address he delivered earlier, on the 15th of February 1819, reveals the philosophical pivot of a man who has watched utopia's snap. He denounces absolute democracy, praises a strong executive, proposes a hereditary Senate in the Bolivian draft later, and suggests the English constitutional model mixed with American republicanism. He wants a lifetime president who can't be tyrant because the laws and the people stay vigilant. This mix comes off like a constitutional blender on high. He's trying to lock in stability with scaffolding that resists civil war. The speech and its follow-ups become catnip for future political science exams. He returns to smash the Spanish in Venezuela, Carabobo on 24 June. 1821 turns Paz's lancers into a storm. The British Legion helps crack the Spanish center. The road to Caracas opens. Royalist pockets hold out in Porto Cabello, but the political momentum is irreversible. Meanwhile, Antonio José de Sucre finishes the liberation of Quito at Pichincha on the 24th of May, 1822, scaling volcano skirts like a mountain goat brigade. Quito, renamed part of the Department of the South, slides into Gran Colombia's embrace. Guayaquil becomes the stage for the epic non-battle. In late July 1820, Bolivar meets José de San Martin behind closed doors. San Martin comes with a plan for a constitutional monarchy in Peru, perhaps a European prince on an American throne. Bolivar, the Republican who still likes a lifetime presidency, sees a hazard in crowns that are not purely symbolic. Nothing is signed that counts. San Martin leaves to Lima, resigns as protector of Peru, and sails into silence. Bolivar stays and takes responsibility for finishing the job against Spain. The Guayaquil Conference becomes a canvas onto which later generations project preferences. Austere gentlemen withdrawing, charismatic whirlwind taking over. Both aware of the math of political capital and the ranks of soldiers who actually show up for roll call, Peru demands logistics and ruthlessness. He arrives in 1823 with legal authority, pushes through political swamps, gets sick, recovers, fight, retreat, returns. Junin, on the 6th of August 1824, becomes a pure cavalry duel on the high plains. Sabres flashing with no firearms discharged, an event that seems engineered to satisfy romance writers and frustrate statisticians. Sucre beats the main Spanish army at Ayacucho on the 9th of December 1824 in the highlands near Quinua. An assault with 5,700 patriots against 9,000 royalists under Viceroy La Serna's command. Ayacucho ends Spanish rule on the continent. Capitulation is signed. Officers hand over swords. The war that began for Bolivar with petitions and earthquakes now tilts to building institutions on scorched earth. The gratitude becomes architectural. Alto Peru names itself Bolivia in 1825. The new state asks for a constitution, and Bolivar gives them one in 1826, with a lifetime presidency and a hereditary senate. That document, loved by some and loathed by others, hammers home his obsession with stability over experimental liberty. He never crowns himself. He never accepts a throne. But he designs a system where the executive sits so securely that critics reach for the word monarchy anyway. He accepts honors and swords and adulation, but he sends a consistent signal. He will not wear a crown. He does, however, enjoy power with a familiarity that worries anyone who thinks rotation keeps governments honest. His leadership burns thousands of calories every day, and his body becomes both tool and liability. Females and fevers punctuate his life. After Guayaquil, he meets Manuela Sanz, the Peruvian, Ecuadorian patriot, who becomes his partner and an intelligence asset. She reads correspondence, monitors plots, rides into chaos, and on the 25th of September, 1828 in Bogotá, she famously intervenes when an assassination squad storms the Palacio de San Carlos. The attackers kill guards, hack at doors. She delays them. Bolivar climbs out a window and escapes. Later, propaganda calls her the Libertadora del Libertador. The couple's letters, full of administrative details and affection, show a personal bond knotted into the fabric of war and politics. Back in Gran Colombia, gratitude decays into suspicion. The Congress at Cúcuta in 1821 lays out a centralist constitution and elects Bolivar as president. With Santander as vice president, laws and taxes appear. Press freedom and political opposition survive but complain loudly. By 1826, a Venezuelan revolt called La Cosiata, led by Paez, announces that Caracas wants administrative autonomy and is tired of obeying Bogotá's paperwork. Bolivar negotiates and pardons, keeps the country glued together with charisma and compromise. He summons the Amphictyonic Congress at Panama in 1826 to create a hemisphere-wide league. The dream of continental unity shows up, takes a polite bow, and then fails to secure attendance and enforcement. The United States sends observers who arrive late. Many delegates leave. No army emerges from the resolutions. It's a diplomatic rehearsal for future summits where everyone signs something and then goes home to ignore it. The debt ledger gets ugly. Wars cost money, and Gran Colombia borrows from British bankers. A £2 million loan in 1824 feels like salvation, and later reads like lead boots. Tariffs struggle to carry the weight. Smuggling stays undefeated. Soldiers demand salary. Veterans want land. A state built in a war doesn't turn into a solvent republic with a few signatures. Bolivar shifts into emergency mode too often. In 1828, he declares himself dictator after a constitutional convention at Ocaña collapses in May. The decree is legal in its own frame and horrifying in another. He claims necessity. Opponents claim ambition. The assassination attempt in September of that year proves that the opposition doesn't just write pamphlets. Meanwhile, the nation shivers with faction. Santander, the vice president suspended and later exiled after the 1828 plot, becomes the hated hero of the legalist camp. Paez, forgiven earlier, organizes Venezuela around himself. Quito's conservatives and liberals snipe. Pasto, always royalist or autonomist, depending on the angle, resists even after independence. Peru and Gran Colombia fight a border war in 1828, 1829. A farewell tour for the United States. Sucre remains the gentleman of battles and negotiating tables until 1830, when an assassin kills him in the mountains of Berruecos. That murder removes a stabilizing force and slaps Bolivar with an extra layer of grief and conspiracy. He has governed without pause for a decade, ridden more miles than anyone sane, and consumed more ink than a medium-sized newspaper. By 1830, his lung disease, likely tuberculosis, may be compounded by chronic infections, makes every breath taxation. He resigns the presidency in Bogotá on the 27th of April, 1830, with a speech marinated in exhaustion. He plans to sail for Europe, perhaps to live in exile, and write a memoir that would outsell everyone's. He never makes it to the boat. Santa Marta receives a skeletal legend. The Spanish house of Joaquín de Mir becomes his hospice. He drafts his final proclamation on the 10th of December, 1830, asking citizens to abandon factional hate and emphasizing the need for institutions. The famous line floats out of his outgoing correspondence that year, in which he laments that those who served the revolution have ploughed the sea. Whether the phrase appears in a particular letter to one dignitary or another gets debated by archivists, but it radiates the same sentiment across sources. Colossal effort, negligible permanence. 1 week later, he is gone. Death magnifies the contradictions of his leadership. His estate is tangled in debt and unpaid salaries. The state he built has already split. Venezuela declares itself independent under Paez in 1830. 1830, we Quito becomes Ecuador under Juan José Flores. New Granada weathers its own turmoil. Bolivar's reputation divides households. For some, he is the absolute liberator, whose military genius and political ruthlessness were forced by circumstances. For others, he is the man who swapped one faraway absolutism for a local executive that wanted eternity. The biography refuses to sit still, and the data points refuse to lie. He wins Boyacá on the 7th of August 1819 by reading terrain and timing better than Murillo. He wins Carabobo on the 24th of June 1821 by aligning pairs El Hileros with Scottish, Irish, and Venezuelan foot soldiers in a way the Spaniards cannot counter. He produces the Angostura Address on the 15th of February 1819 and the Bolivian Constitution in 1826 to engineer a plan for order. He orders the war to the death in 1813 and then years later speaks of clemency and amnesty. He negotiates with kings and presidents and smugglers. He falls, rises, falls again, and wins anyway. He calls on British veterans to die on foreign fields for a vision they adopt because their own countries offer nothing. He accepts Haitian help with terms that drag his revolution toward emancipation. He relies on Manuela Sanz, on Sucre, on Paez, on Santander, and manages to fight with 3 of them by the end. Humor creeps through the epic because the absurdity of running a continent-sized insurgency deserves laughter. He pushes a decree literally named war to the death, as if the brand manager for terror got a bonus for clarity. He lays out a Pan-American League in Panama without consulting the calendar of half the delegates, a meeting that evaporates in heat and declarations. He rides into towns where the official portrait of him gets hoisted over doors while the local treasurer still cannot find coins to pay the army band. He publishes manifestos like a teenager with a new blog, then fights like a general who understands supply lines and morale. He wields pageantry like a weapon and simultaneously complains that glory is a prison. He receives swords studded with diamonds and then spends nights arguing over rations. Leadership for him becomes a staircase built in the dark. He pushes centralism because the Republic nearly died of federalism before it could crawl. He hands out pardons because Colombia needs men on horses more than it needs purity. He courts Cordillos and tries to domesticate them with titles and constitutions. He promotes merit but negotiates constantly with class and race realities that refuse to vanish because a decree says so. He uses terror briefly and loudly, then writes laws to restrain future terror. He writes like a man who knows posterity reads everything and still forgets most of it. Historians keep receipts and slice the legend with facts. John Lynch tracks the political zigzags with patience. Maria Arena paints the human, febrile, theatrical Bolivar in Bolivar, American Liberator with details that smell like campfire smoke and ink. Robert Harvey crunches battles with the energy of a military analyst who also enjoys gossip. The Archivo del Libertador hoards letters that map alliances with the precision of a nervous bookkeeper. Every source nudges the same picture into focus. A workaholic visionary who understood geography like a general and psychology like a politician. A man who could not resist the temptation to stabilize a continent by holding it tightly, and who then discovered that continents behave like cats. Myths stand around like cardboard cutouts, and they require polite demolition. He did not single-handedly liberate South America. Many hands carried the flags. San Martin through the southern cone, Sucre in Quito and Ayacucho, Paz in the Llanos, Santander in administration and law, and thousands of anonymous campesinos and enslaved people who bet their lives on a promise. He was not a modern Democrat in the 21st century sense. He distrusted unfiltered majoritarianism and built constitutions where executives could outlast storms. He was not a pure abolitionist from the start. He evolved under Haitian influence and wartime necessity And though he pushed emancipation, the full abolition of slavery took decades after him in some regions, with Venezuela not abolishing slavery until 1854 and New Granada adopting gradual measures in the 1820s and 1830s. He did not aim to be king. He repeatedly refused crowns but flirted with lifetime mandates, a choice he rationalized as a barricade against anarchy. The numbers keep the conversation honest. His armies win major battles at Cuca in 1413, Arar in 1413, Boyacá in 1413, Boyacá in 1421, Bomboná in 1421, Bomboná in 1421, and Junín in 1424, among others. And Sucre closes with Ayacucho in 1424. Casualty tables show irregular units on both sides, bleeding at alarming rates. Desertion spines the rear of every campaign. The Andes crossing of 1819 likely cuts his effectives by a third through weather alone. The Congress of Angostura marks a real attempt at statehood, and the Cúcuta Constitution in 1821 offers a centralist framework that lasts 8 years. The 1824 British loan of roughly £2 million buys time but binds Gran Colombia to creditors across an ocean and deepens the fiscal hole when customs revenues underperform. The scenes remain cinematic even after the varnish is stripped. He rides into Bogotá in 1819 in a borrowed carriage, draped with improvisation, while Spanish officers retreat past fans who pretend not to see them. He surveys Carabobo's field where smoke curls around dead horses and hugs surviving officers with a face that looks 20 years older than his passport. He listens to petitions from Afro-descended soldiers demanding the land they were promised, and writes back orders that redirect plots, delay payments, or create pathways for manumission. He signs a decree in Angostura that a newspaper prints quickly, because revolutions without printing presses mutate into rumor mills. He talks always and sleeps rarely. He measures loyalty with a nervy balance of charm and threat. His leadership shows a consistent habit. He learns. In 1812, federalism becomes for him a powder keg. In 1813, he tries terror as policy. In 1815, he works through pen and argument in Jamaica. In 1816, he attaches emancipation to recruitment. In 1817, he anchors the state on a river, not a capital city with a cathedral. In 1819, he chooses geography over calendar and wins through altitude. In 1821, he pushes a single constitution for a cluster of regions that don't love centralization, then spends the rest of the decade trying to sweet-talk and sometimes bully provinces into staying. The line between adaptability and opportunism thins, but it's there, visible in the order of his decrees. He also lives by performance. Bolivar is a commander who understands that wars are fought in mines, as well as on plains. Titles matter. Ritual matters. When the people of Mérida call him Libertador in 1813, he accepts because he grasps that names consolidate authority. He rides at the head of parades because morale is fuel. He writes in sentences with rhythm because rhetorical cadence pushes tired men to march. He creates foundable myths while standing in blood and mud. He keeps a horse ready and a desk loaded with paper because both vehicles take him where he wants to go. Defeat shapes him as much as triumph. The 1814 collapse under Bough's chisels, a permanent skepticism about confederations that can't coordinate. The 1826 La Cosiata revolt in Venezuela teaches him the limits of charisma against local power. The 1828 assassination attempt proves that words like dictator turn people into active enemies, not just passive critics. The death of Sucre in 1830 acts like a bell tolling for the entire project. He watches Gran Colombia splinter and writes, even in illness, to calm the chaos. He exits with a recommendation for unity and a body of work that admits errors while insisting on the necessity of strength. Then the afterlife goes to work. His enemies in 1830 consider him defeated. His statues in 1834 start striding across plazas anyway. New Venezuelans and Colombians and Ecuadorians rename their cities, carve his profile on coins, and recite his sentences to children in classrooms with high ceilings and chalk dust. Pan-American idealists cite Panama 1826 as a spiritual ancestor. Centralists point to Cucuta 1821. Regionalists sigh and walk away. Revolutionary romantics underline Junin like a heartbeat. Civil libertarians keep one eye on his lifetime executive proposals like a caution sign in stone. Facts keep interrupting worship in a way he might approve. His remains go home to Caracas in 1842, interred with ceremony in a republic that would fight a civil war anyway. His bones get exhumed again in 2010 to probe whether he died of poison or disease. Forensic teams say tuberculosis is the likely culprit, not arsenic. Even in death, he attracts committees. His legacy plays host to every argument the region loves. Centralism versus federalism, strength versus law, charisma versus institution, dream versus budget. The leadership of Simón Bolivar rests on inconvenient competence. He understands how to break an empire with speed plus paper. He knows how to make promises that mobilize people and then write new laws to make some of those promises hold. He recognizes that armies run on imagination and grain. He realizes that Llaneros can be allies if treated as partners, not as footnotes. He learns that the Atlantic economy funds as much as it strangles. He sees that a constitution without enforcement turns into literature. He rules like a man who fears chaos more than he fears criticism. He governs as if the enemy waits on the next hill, which for most of the 1810s and 1820s is correct. He makes tough choices, sometimes indefensible ones, inside an arena where the purest ideals regularly get knifed by the simplest logistics. He loses friends to murder and exile, and he never gets the peaceful retirement he once promised himself near the gardens of Europe. He leaves a map speckled with his surname and a set of cautionary tales. Leaders after him can look at Carabobo and see the dividends of coalition, at Angostura and see the necessity of institution, at the Bolivian Constitution and see the hazard of smothering liberty in the name of order, at Panama and see the distance between aspiration and attendance. They can read the Jamaica letter to understand how the past builds fences across futures, and the final proclamation to understand how exhaustion writes truth. The dramatic irony sticks the landing. He frees countries that later argue about his methods under statues of his face. He fights monarchs and gives republics a template that suits monarchs in everything but name. He promises liberty and drafts structures that try to prevent liberty from dissolving into anarchy. He calls himself a soldier of freedom and then becomes a civil engineer of legitimacy, laying down constitutional beams while cannons still fire in the distance. The punchline writes itself in stone and dust. He is the Liberator, a planner with a saber, a reader of maps and men. He's a reformer who dressed as a warlord when the moment demanded, and a warlord who wrote like a reformer when the morning after required. He is a man who could ride through hail and paperwork on the same day and leave both looking defeated. He is a leader who kept grabbing an entire subcontinent by the lapels and insisting it hold together a little longer. He is a human being who lives out the paradox of revolution. Build fast enough to survive, slow enough to last. He dies saying the nation needs virtue and talent, and he dies understanding how rare those commodities remain in any century. The continent keeps rolling, sometimes toward his dream, sometimes away. Armies change uniforms. Borders get redrawn. The debt to Haiti goes unacknowledged in school books until scholars insist. The phrase about ploughing the sea hovers, stingy and accurate. He led like a man who believed the impossible could be budgeted and scheduled. He proved it correct just long enough for history to ask for maintenance crews that never fully arrived. The ledger closes with a messy profit. 6 nations trace their independence through his campaigns. Millions of people inherit states, where the idea of citizenship and the notion of sovereignty override the habit of empire. The cost remains visible in cemeteries and in municipal archives, bound in leather where unpaid vouchers sleep. The achievement remains luminous in the survival of states built under conditions that would crack most leaders by Thursday. He exits the stage with lungs exhausted and a suitcase not quite packed for the voyage that never happens. He leaves behind a continent that says his name in every capital. When the national anthem hits the crescendo, he also leaves behind warnings encoded in addresses and decrees, signals to future leaders that liberty without discipline conjures wolves, and discipline without liberty recruits tyrants. He chases balance, overshoots it, corrects, overcorrects, and then runs out of time. The story refuses to accept an ending. It keeps accelerating into classrooms and parliaments, showing how one man tried to shepherd geography into nationhood and how the terrain kicked back. It reads like a road movie platted with policy memos. It sounds like drums on a hillside and pages turning late at night. It tastes like dust. It looks like cavalry riding across a paramo and a signature drying under a constitution that people will fight about in the morning. It moves like a continent, learning to walk, and it lands with a sentence he would recognize as a command. Not a quote. Hold your freedom together long enough to deserve it.